Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fact Check Simplified. Today we're talking about that time when the entire healthcare industry was simultaneously held in a digital headlock by anonymous nerds in dark rooms, and the result was less like a spy thriller and more like a poorly managed high-stakes corporate disaster. Think of it as the world's worst startup pitch meeting gone global, where the product was an unbreakable digital lock on your grandmother's pacemaker data, and the price was a terrifying, non-negotiable pile of Bitcoin. The whole situation was an absurd collision between the rapid push for interconnected efficiency, the siren song of the modern world, and the deeply entrenched, ancient infrastructure of a system designed to save lives. They digitized everything, promised us the future, and then completely forgot that the digital future comes standard with digital burglars who don't care about your Hippocratic oath. It's a mess. We love explaining messes here before the inevitable corporate betrayal starts. If you enjoy this highly dramatic but fun version of Modern Facts, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us pay the electric bill for our overpriced standing desks. All right, grab an iced latte. Things are about to get unnecessarily infuriating. The premise here is brutally simple. The internet situation became a matter of life and death the moment ransomware decided hospitals were just another high-value target. For years, every CIO was warned about the perils of legacy systems, the critical need for security patching, and the fact that an ancient Windows XP machine running a billion-dollar MRI scanner was a ticking time bomb. But security, that was always a cost center, a tedious chore, something you handle after you get the shiny new patient portal that lets people schedule appointments with 3 unnecessary clicks. So, what happened? The ancient, paper-thin security of massive healthcare systems finally met the ruthless, optimized efficiency of modern ransomware gangs, creating a chaotic, life-or-death intersection. It wasn't just a system outage, it was a full-scale digital siege, and the patients were trapped inside the firewall. The whole thing screams, we prioritize convenience over human survival. The hackers didn't even need to be world-class spies. They just needed one overworked, underpaid IT guy at 3 a.m. to miss one system alert, or for one phishing email to land in the inbox of an administrator who thought the subject line urgent payroll update click here was totally legit. Cause hospitals, driven by efficiency and government mandates, transitioned to complex, interconnected electronic systems that held everything. Effect, these systems became a single, lucrative, and easy-to-target digital vault. Consequence, when the vault was hit, the entire operational capacity from admissions to surgery scheduling shattered instantly. Narrator meet a commentary, the sheer audacity of trusting a life-saving enterprise to security that would make a neighborhood bank blush is the defining contradiction of the digital age. They streamlined the patient intake process right into a brick wall. The attack wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a quiet creep. One morning, nurses showed up, logged into their terminals, and were greeted not by patient charts, but by a skull and crossbones graphic and a polite, chilling message demanding a massive cryptocurrency payment. Admission stopped, x-rays became invisible, pharmacy orders lost to the digital void. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was terrifyingly disruptive. Try performing an emergency surgery when you can. Access the patient's blood type, allergies, or prior surgical notes because a criminal organization has locked the files in a vault secured by military-grade encryption. Hospitals were immediately forced to revert to archaic, manual processes. Suddenly, clipboards, pens, and runners moving physical files between wards were the most advanced technology they had. This forced reversion to the 1980s proved one thing: the tech was great until it failed spectacularly, and when it failed, the backup plan was basically wishful thinking. The shocking snapshot line here: one major regional medical center, upon being locked out of their electronic medical records system, lost for critical hours trying to locate a single patient's paper chart only to find it had been shredded 3 years ago in a digital transition. Efficiency drive. Efficiency, meet irony. The sheer scale of the disruption was breathtaking. It wasn't localized to a billing department, it was systemic. Everything connected to the hospital's network, from the coffee machine IP address to the blood analyzer, was effectively turned into a fancy, inert paperweight. The system that was supposed to save lives had been weaponized against the very people it was built to serve, and who paid the immediate price. Not the tech executives who signed off on the flimsy security budget, but the patients waiting for a critical surgery, the mother in the emergency room, and the overworked doctors forced to make agonizing decisions based on incomplete whispered information. The ransomware attackers, in their infinite, profitable cynicism, understood one thing perfectly: no organization has a higher, more immediate incentive to pay a huge ransom than one whose product is human life. It turns out that digital security is only optional, until the moment your digital dependency makes you the perfect, paralyzed victim. The internet situation got messy the second a hacker realized the stakes weren't just data, but breathing, waiting people. The moment of digital paralysis had arrived, and with it, the silicon swashbucklers, the ransomware gangs themselves, made their grand, terrifying entrance. They operated with the cold, optimized professionalism of a hostile takeover, only instead of stock certificates, they had seized patient files and the entire operational heartbeat of critical care facilities. Anonymously encrypted networks ground hospital admissions to a grinding halt. Imagine the scene: a sprawling, multi-million-dollar medical complex, capable of pioneering heart transplants, now reduced to chaos because some digital lock in a server room decided to stop playing nice. The emergency rooms, the supposed pinnacle of technological preparedness, had to immediately revert to the medical dark ages. They hauled out the infamous clipboards and a prayer the low-tech contingency plan that no one actually believed they'd ever use in the 21st century. The absurd contradiction was screamingly obvious. They had self-driving surgical robots, but they couldn't securely back up a spreadsheet. The impact was immediate and visceral. When the network is down, the fancy monitoring equipment doesn't talk to the central nursing station. When the network is down, lab results, the things doctors use to make life and death decisions in minutes, can't be automatically delivered. Instead, someone had to physically print them out, assuming the network still allowed the printer to function, and then run them across the building. It was medical care delivered by foot messenger. Only the clock was ticking against septic shock or a ruptured appendix, not just a missed delivery deadline. This wasn't just a minor slowdown. It was an active degradation of care, and the attackers knew it. They were weaponizing the necessity of speed and efficiency in healthcare against the institution itself. Cause: hospitals heavily automated all internal logistics and critical data access. Effect: encryption instantly severed the flow of time-sensitive, life-saving information. Consequence: doctors were forced to practice blind, relying on immediate physical assessment and memory rather than comprehensive medical history. Narrator meta commentary: the idea that we built systems so efficient they had zero tolerance for failure, effectively betting human life on perfect uptime, is the peak of modern hubris. The efficiency gurus were silenced by a single line of malicious code. The irony here is truly magnificent. The healthcare system had spent the last 2 decades obsessively implementing massive, interconnected electronic medical records (EMR) systems. They promised seamless care, reducing errors, and universal accessibility. Instead, they built a massive, singular target rich with intimate data and high financial stakes. They consolidated all the eggs into one digital basket and placed it right outside the burglar's window. Now, the swashbucklers had the keys, and the resulting chaos proved that, in the rush for digital convenience, security was always the neglected middle child. The quick snapshot line here is a chilling reminder of the stakes. During one major hack, one large hospital chain was forced to delay chemotherapy appointments for over 1,500 patients nationwide because they couldn't safely and accurately verify drug dosages. Without access to the EMR, lives paused because a server sneezed. And let's talk about the messaging from the perpetrators, delivered via the ransomware note. It wasn't a rambling manifesto, it was a cold, precise invoice. They were basically the world's worst customer service. We apologize for the inconvenience, but your files are now exclusively locked by us. For a seamless restoration experience, please remit the equivalent of $10 million in Monero to the following untraceable wallet. Thank you for using our high-grade encryption product. They treated their crime as a service, ransomware as a service, actually complete with technical documentation and sometimes even a proof of life decryption of a few patient files, just to show they meant business and, gasp, actually had the key. This professionalization of digital crime, stripping away the childish prank factor and replacing it with pure, terrifying monetization, is what made this whole situation so incredibly dark and effective. The digital bandits didn't even see patients. They just saw an annualized revenue stream attached to a high-urgency decryption fee. And as the hospital scrambled for those ancient clipboards, the swashbucklers were already budgeting for their next digital yacht. Now, let's talk about the absolute digital audacity of the price tag. We're not discussing a few $100s for a locked phone. We're staring down the $10 million decryption key. The sheer magnitude of the ransomware demand turned life-saving medical data into a grotesque, Binary bargaining chip. This wasn't petty theft, this was sophisticated. Strategic extortion targeted at institutions known to possess both massive wealth and a non-negotiable legal and moral obligation to preserve life. The criminals understood the business model better than the victims. A hospital can't afford a week of downtime, not financially and certainly not ethically. This is where the cold calculus of the digital age truly became horrifying. The value of the key wasn't based on the cost of the data itself, but on the potential catastrophic human cost tally of not having it. The attackers were monetizing human suffering and institutional paralysis. Every hour the network was down, the risk of a patient error or a tragic oversight spiked. The hackers calculated that risk and slapped a 7- or 8-figure price tag on the resolution. This proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that for these high-level cyber syndicates, no institution, not even one dedicated to healing, was the sacred for digital extortion. Everything had a price, and that price was paid in untraceable cryptocurrency. Cause: ransomware gangs identified the extreme urgency and high financial liquidity of hospital systems. Effect: demands escalated dramatically, moving from 5 figures to 8 figures in a matter of months. Consequence: hospitals were put into an impossible ethical dilemma: fund international crime or potentially watch patients suffer from critical care delays. Narrator meet a commentary. The moral abyss opens up when a hospital board discusses the pros and cons of wiring $10 million in Bitcoin to a criminal cartel in a foreign land. They're literally negotiating with the digital Grim Reaper's accountant. The process itself was a masterpiece of cold efficiency. The ransomware note provided clear instructions, often better than the hospital's own IT support documentation. They needed the payment swiftly, in a specified digital currency, and often included a countdown clock. That ticking timer wasn't just a psychological pressure tactic, it was a business accelerator. The longer the hospital waited, the more lives were impacted, and the more leverage the attackers gained. It was a perfect, self-optimizing loop of digital villainy. Meanwhile, the executives, who had previously slashed IT security budgets and signed off on the world's longest EULA nobody read, were now in a panic room, frantically calling insurance brokers and third-party incident response firms. These firms, the digital mercenaries, were suddenly the only game in town. They charged exorbitant emergency rates, becoming a highly profitable, reactive industry born entirely out of massive institutional failure. The ultimate irony: the hospital was now paying to different groups of expensive contractors, the legal ones trying to fix the mess, and the criminal ones who created it. The quick snapshot line here: experts estimate that for every dollar spent on the actual ransom, organizations spend another $10 on the incident response, cleanup, and eventual system rebuild. The ransom is just a down payment on the humiliation. This whole situation highlighted a massive systemic failure of imagination. For years, the security conversation in healthcare revolved around HIPAA compliance protecting privacy. But the attackers bypassed the privacy fence entirely and went straight for the operational fence, locking up the actual ability to function. The threat wasn't "we'll tell everyone your diagnosis." It was "we will prevent the diagnosis from happening at all." They shifted the target from compliance risk of fine to operational risk of fatality, dramatically spiking the perceived value of the decryption key. And as the IT teams worked themselves to exhaustion fighting the digital siege, the attackers were sipping champagne, their untraceable crypto wallets swelling from the collective, paralyzed fear of the global healthcare industry. The digital ecosystem had successfully commodified terror. The hospital board finally swallowed their pride and looked to their supposed safety net, only to discover that insurance said, "Tough luck, patch cyber insurance." Once enthusiastically hailed by finance departments as the ultimate risk mitigation tool for digital disasters, suddenly became an opaque, bureaucratic maze of technicalities the moment the crisis hit maximum panic. It turned out those hefty annual premiums only bought them a front row seat to an endless debate about semantics. The policies, printed in the microscopic font of digital betrayal, were riddled with exclusions. Think of it, the hospital had paid millions for coverage against digital catastrophe, only to find the policy contained clauses like failure to implement multi-factor authentication on administrative accounts or the dreaded acts of war provision. Seriously, some insurers tried to argue that a highly organized, state-backed, or even just state-adjacent ransomware attack was an act of digital warfare, thereby instantly voiding the payout. The legal teams, already exhausted, were now locked in a metaphysical battle over whether an encrypted file constituted a hostile declaration by a foreign power. Cause: cyber insurance companies wrote increasingly narrow policies, to protect themselves from high-cost, high-frequency cyber events. Effect: when a predictable, massive attack occurred, the insurance industry instantly activated legal loopholes and technical exclusions. Consequence: hospitals were left holding the bag for the ransom payment and the cleanup, creating a massive financial shock with zero relief. Narrator Meta commentary: the digital safety net turned out to be a flimsy, hole-ridden trampoline. They sold peace of mind but delivered nothing but paperwork and a lawyer. This is the ultimate example of modern risk transfer. You pay the money, they keep the risk. The irony here is delicious and infuriating. The entire ransomware economy is partly fueled by the existence of cyber insurance. The criminals, acting like sophisticated market analysts, knew that their targets could often afford to pay, because a third party, the insurer, was theoretically on the hook. This created a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. Insurance made paying easier, which incentivized more attacks, which drove up the cost of insurance, which, well, you get the picture. It was a business model where every participant, except the patient, was making money off the continuous escalation of digital chaos. The bureaucratic stall was catastrophic, while the insurance adjuster argued over the precise definition of reasonable security measures. Patients were waiting hours for critical scans, and emergency rooms were turning away ambulances. Lives were paused while tech negotiated, and insurance companies stonewalled. The time lag between the attack and the decision to pay the ransom, often dictated by the insurance provider, as slow, agonizing assessment was the deadliest part of the entire ordeal. The quick snapshot line here: after the major hospital hacks, the global cyber insurance market saw premiums increase by over 70% in a single year, while simultaneously slashing coverage limits and adding more technical exclusions. Pay more for less protection, the modern consumer experience. And this brings us back to the blame game blocker. Instead of immediately marshaling resources to rebuild, the immediate aftermath devolved into corporate and governmental finger-pointing. Insurance companies blamed the hospitals for poor internal patching. Hospitals blamed third-party software vendors for shipping vulnerable code. Software vendors blamed the regulatory bodies for not mandating stricter standards. Everyone had a perfectly laminated document proving it wasn't their fault, while the patients were still stuck in a system running on ancient software in sheer desperation. The focus was instantly on liability, not remediation. This paralysis proved that the entire digital ecosystem prioritizes legal defensibility over actual resilience. The lesson learned: read the fine print, because when the digital siege comes, you're essentially on your own. The digital architecture that was supposed to usher in an era of seamless, flawless medical care was the very thing that buckled under the pressure, leading to the EMR meltdown. The widespread transition to massive, interconnected electronic medical records EMR systems. The massive, monolithic software suites designed by a handful of giant vendors promised efficiency, reduced paperwork, and a 360-degree view of the patient. In reality, they secretly created a single, catastrophic point of failure for the entire healthcare infrastructure, making it the perfect target for those highly motivated silicon swashbucklers. The push was understandable: ditch the filing cabinets, save the trees, and have every piece of data instantly available across the network. But that instant accessibility meant that when the core server became encrypted, everything became instantly inaccessible. Think of the EMR as the central nervous system of the hospital. When the nerves stop firing because they've been chemically locked, the whole body, the operating rooms, the labs, the pharmacy stops moving. They built a system so integrated that a hiccup in one module meant total, agonizing paralysis in all of them. It was a failure of distributed risk management, fueled by the industry's desire for one massive, expensive, one-stop-shop vendor solution. Cause EMR systems centralize vast quantities of critical patient data and integrated operational controls onto a single network spine. Effect: a single ransomware breach could instantly paralyze 90% of a hospital's clinical and administrative functions. Consequence: the cost of the attack skyrocketed because the downtime directly translated to compromised patient safety and massive revenue loss. Narrator Meta commentary: we traded messy, localized paper records where only a few files could burn at a time for a clean, centralized digital system where a single hacker can set fire to the entire library instantaneously. That's modern progress. Folks, the vendor lock-in compounded the problem. Hospitals spent billions implementing these complex systems, meaning they couldn't just swap them out when security vulnerabilities were discovered. They were stuck, beholden to the patch cycle and security whims of a handful of enormous EMR companies, who often lagged in fixing known flaws because, frankly, They were too big and too profitable to move quickly. The hospitals had outsourced their core operations to a third party, and when that third party was digitally compromised, they had no internal recourse. This created a situation where clinical care was dependent on a software company's quarterly earnings call and patch schedule. A terrifying concept. The quick snapshot line here: during one of the most prominent EMR-related hacks, hospitals were unable to electronically communicate with surrounding care centers, leading to a breakdown in regional patient transfer coordination and forcing multiple hospitals to divert ambulances simultaneously. Chaos went exponential. The true moment of despair arrived when the IT teams discovered that even their vaunted backups were locked because the systems were so intertwined. The ransomware often sat dormant and spread slowly, ensuring that by the time it activated and encrypted the primary EMR, it had also quietly encrypted the network-attached backup servers. The backups are our Plan B strategy failed spectacularly because the Plan B was sitting right next to Plan A, protected by the same flimsy security protocol. This wasn't just incompetence. It was a fundamental misreading of the modern threat landscape. A classic case of assuming the digital fire alarm was enough protection without ever considering the structural integrity of the building. The hospital was left negotiating with criminals over data they already owned, simply because they lacked a clean, isolated restoration point. The EULA nobody read didn't cover what to do when we literally can't find your vital data. Amidst the chaos, the focus narrowed to the unsung, overworked heroes of the entire digital drama, the IT team's existential dread. These were the brilliant, underpaid hospital staff who had been warning management for years about the outdated firewalls, the ignored patches, and the gaping security holes in the multi-million-dollar EMR system. Now they weren't just fighting a digital battle. They were fighting a digital siege armed with nothing but duct tape, caffeine, and the crushing knowledge that human lives hung on their ability to defeat military-grade encryption with a consumer-grade budget. They were immediately forced into an impossible choice: fight the relentless digital enemy, scouring gigabytes of compromised network logs for a single unencrypted corner, or authorize a multi-million-dollar payoff to literal criminals knowing that paying only guaranteed the cycle would continue. This wasn't a technical problem. It was a profound ethical and operational crisis dumped squarely on the shoulders of the people whose budget proposals had been slashed every fiscal year. They were the ones negotiating with the digital kidnappers, often in the dark, anonymous chat rooms of the dark web negotiation theater, while simultaneously trying to keep the lights on and the absolute minimum critical systems like HIPAA for surgical sterility running on segregated, frantically isolated networks. Cause hospital IT teams were historically under-resourced, warnings were ignored, and they operated with inadequate security tools. Effect: when the attack hit, they were overwhelmed, under pressure, and morally compromised by the payment decision. Consequence: stress and burnout skyrocketed, while the immediate need for outside, high-cost digital mercenaries became unavoidable. Narrator meta commentary: the true irony. The heroes are the ones who were perpetually told no on their budget requests, and the villains succeeded because the finance committee said yes to cheap, vulnerable software. The board finally learned the price of technical debt. The pressure cooker was unbearable. Every minute wasted arguing over the $10 million decryption key meant more sideline patients, digital triage, more delayed surgeries, and canceled appointments. The IT team became the unwilling gatekeepers of life and death, desperately trying to discern which servers hadn't been fully compromised, which backups were clean, and whether the ransom negotiation team was actually talking to the real hackers or a double extortion scammer. Yes, that's a thing. You get hacked, you start paying the ransom, and then another hacker group jumps in and demands money to stop leaking the data the first group stole. It's the digital version of sharks feeding on a wounded whale. No chill, zero dignity. The quick snapshot line here: a post-mortem of one regional hospital breach revealed that the initial ransomware infection was successfully flagged by the antivirus software, but the system administrator, who was also covering the help desk and compliance reporting, dismissed the alert as a false positive during a particularly chaotic morning shift. Human error meets overwhelming workload. The resulting influx of external incident response firms, the aforementioned digital mercenaries, added another layer of insult to injury. These highly paid consultants swanned in, confirming the IT team's previous warnings, charging 5 times the annual salary of the internal staff per week, and then issuing a final report that basically said, "You should have patched your system." The local IT team, who had been sleeping under their desks fighting the fire for 72 hours straight, got the blame, while the external firm got the exorbitant payout. This is the ultimate example of modern corporate accountability. When something breaks, you pay a consultant a fortune to tell you what the in-house expert already knew, and then you pay the criminals to undo the damage. It was a humiliating, existential defeat for the people who actually understood the network, proving that expertise is often secondary to the bottom line, until the bottom line is measured in body bags. The digital chaos metastasized immediately into a profound human catastrophe, resulting in sidelined patients, digital triage, when the core systems went dark. Non-emergency surgeries, routine checkups, diagnostic scans, and essential treatments were postponed indefinitely. This wasn't just a scheduling inconvenience, this was a surreal, terrifying consequence where a coding error physically stopped the progression of human health. If your cancer treatment required an MRI to monitor progression, and the MRI machine couldn't send the imaging data to the EMR system, your treatment stopped. The hospital was forced into an agonizing digital triage, the kind of ethically fraught decision-making that usually happens only on a battlefield. They had to determine who was critical enough to be admitted and treated using slow, error-prone manual methods, and who could afford to wait until the digital siege was lifted. The immediate priority shifted from optimal care to survival only. Patients with chronic conditions, those waiting for hip replacements or minor cardiac procedures, suddenly found their care shunted into a dangerous holding pattern. The digital breach didn't just lock files, it locked hope, turning anticipated healing into indefinite, anxious waiting. The systemic failure of EMR access forced hospitals to severely limit intake and prioritize only the most acute, life-threatening cases. Effect: elective and time-sensitive non-emergency procedures were canceled or postponed, delaying care for thousands of patients. Consequence: the health outcomes for non-critical patients were actively degraded, increasing the long-term human cost of the cyber attack. Narrator Meta commentary: the digital attack was truly democratic in its cruelty. It didn't just hurt the hospital's finances, it inflicted random, systemic damage across the entire patient population, proving that in modern society, technical debt is paid in human capital. The most jarring sight was the emergency room. Instead of the typical, high-tech ballet of screens and instant data transfer, doctors were running on gut instinct and physical, handwritten notes scrawled on whatever paper was available. Imagine trying to stabilize a stroke victim without instant access to their medication list, past history of anticoagulants, or real-time CT scan data flowing into the system. The margin for error which technology was supposed to eliminate exploded. Ambulances had to be diverted to neighboring, unhacked facilities, often sending patients on significantly longer, more critical journeys, assuming those other hospitals weren't already overwhelmed by their own internet situation. It was a cascading failure that crossed municipal and even state lines, proving that network vulnerability is a public health crisis. The quick snapshot line here: following one major network paralysis event, it was revealed that the number of adverse patient events, medical errors, complications, etc., reported at the affected hospital temporarily spiked by over 30%, due solely to the forced reliance on manual, fragmented information. The system failed, and people paid for it. The cruel irony was that these delays and complications were a direct consequence of the hospital's commitment to modernization. They had grown so dependent on the seamless, interconnected EMR meltdown systems that they had failed to maintain robust, tested manual contingency plans. The transition was supposed to make things safer, but by putting all operational faith into a single digital spine, they inadvertently introduced a single point of failure that nearly crippled them. The patients, who had trusted the system to protect their health, found themselves abandoned at the mercy of a criminal negotiation taking place in the bizarre, high-stakes anonymous, dark web negotiation theater. Their lives were essentially being held in digital escrow, awaiting a multi-million-dollar transaction in untraceable cryptocurrency. While the exhausted IT team's existential dread were fighting digital fires and sideline patients, digital triage were waiting. The real action was happening in the murky, high-stakes anonymous chat rooms of the dark web negotiation theater. This was the bizarre, surreal landscape where the fate of multi-billion-dollar healthcare systems and the lives of thousands were being decided. The process wasn't conducted via formal diplomatic channels or phone calls. It was via an encrypted, temporary chat interface provided by the very criminals who initiated the attack. The criminals, acting with the disconcerting professionalism of terrible customer service reps, outlined their terms. They weren't shadowy, cackling hackers. They were methodical, detailed, and utterly immoral entrepreneurs. They were selling a product, the decryption key, and they needed to prove that their software worked. that the price was non-negotiable, and that they offered a guaranteed, if morally repugnant, path back to operational stability. They even had facts for the negotiation process and occasionally a brief, chilling proof of life where they decrypt one random, non-critical file to show the hospital that, yes, they actually possessed the only key, cause, the specialized nature of the ransomware and the anonymity required for payment necessitated negotiation in dark web chat rooms. Effect: high stakes, life or death decisions were funneled through an informal, untraceable, and psychologically manipulative channel. Consequence: incident response firms, charging exorbitant fees, became the only intermediaries legally and technically capable of handling the negotiation and payment process. Narrator meta commentary: the digital age has perfected the art of outsourcing. Immorality: the hospital hired a proxy to argue with a criminal proxy over the release of data, turning a health crisis into a bizarre e-commerce transaction for stolen assets. The hospital wasn't directly communicating. Of course, they hired specialized third-party negotiators, digital mercenaries who entered the theater. These firms charged obscene hourly rates to engage in the digital bazaar, translating the terrifying clinical crisis into the cold, calculated language of risk management and cryptocurrency wallets. The negotiation wasn't about sympathy or morality. It was about shaving $1 million off the $10 million decryption key while the clock ticked down. It was a purely transactional relationship. The criminals had a product, the key, and the hospital had an urgent, non-optional need, the return to function. The snapshot line here: negotiation experts noted that ransomware gangs often monitor public news reports about the affected hospital to gauge the level of media pressure and operational paralysis, adjusting their ransom demand upward if they sense desperation. They're not just hackers, they're cynical news analysts. This whole process was utterly corrosive to the rule of law and ethical standards. Every successful payment, every cryptocurrency transfer, poured billions into the ransomware as a service gig ecosystem, guaranteeing the criminals' ability to invest in more sophisticated tools and target the next wave of vulnerable institutions. The hospital was forced into the pay or burn logic trap, effectively becoming a reluctant venture capitalist for international crime. They paid not because it was right, but because the cost of not paying, measured in prolonged downtime, legal liability, and patient fatalities, was exponentially higher than the ransom itself. And as the funds transferred into the untraceable wallets, the IT team began the long, agonizing process of restoration, knowing full well they had just contributed to the success of their own aggressor. The crisis, having been utterly ignored when it was just an IT team's existential dread problem, finally became unavoidable, forcing government gets out the wrench. Regulatory bodies and federal agencies, who had been content to issue vague security guidelines and confusing compliance paperwork for years, suddenly stirred. They realized with dawning horror that patching your system wasn't just tedious compliance homework. It was now a matter of genuine national security, critical infrastructure integrity, and, most horrifyingly for a bureaucracy, a potential spike in more capacity. This political awakening was motivated less by altruism and more by self-preservation. When the hacks paralyzed multiple major hospitals across different states, the resulting public outrage and the undeniable human cost made it impossible to sweep under the rug. The federal agencies couldn't credibly claim the problem was localized. It was clearly systemic, exploiting the massive, integrated vulnerabilities that came standard with the EMR meltdown systems. The government's immediate instinct wasn't to secure, but to regulate, often with a ham-fisted approach, trying to apply 20th century policy solutions to a uniquely 21st century problem. Cause: widespread, high-profile hospital ransomware attacks cause massive public concern and national security alarms. Effect: regulatory bodies shifted from advisory roles to mandatory enforcement, and the discussion of punitive measures. Consequence: new, often rushed and poorly conceptualized, cybersecurity mandates were threatened, leading to friction between government, hospitals, and tech vendors. Narrator meta commentary: bureaucracy is always the last responder. They only show up when the fire is so big it's casting a shadow on the Capitol dome, proving that political will follows disaster. It rarely precedes it. The initial reaction from the agencies was a flurry of emergency advisories and, critically, a firm public stance against paying the $10 million decryption key ransom. This was admirable in theory, a way to starve the ransomware as a service gig beast. But in practice, it put hospitals in an even tighter bind. The government was saying, don't pay the ransom, while offering zero immediate, practical help to regain access to critical systems. They were demanding ethical purity in a literal life or death crisis, a political stance that looked great on a press release, but did nothing to help the doctor trying to treat a patient without their medical history. The quick snapshot line here: following the major wave of attacks, the Department of Homeland Security quietly classified large hospital systems as critical infrastructure, a designation previously reserved for power grids and banking, underscoring the shift in perceived national risk. The government's heavy-handed response quickly morphed into the post-attack compliance avalanche. Instead of funding proactive defense or mandating simple, effective standards like multi-factor authentication across the board, the default solution was an avalanche of new, hyper-detailed, and often impossible to implement compliance paperwork. The hospitals were now burdened with proving they were following the rules, while simultaneously trying to rebuild their shattered networks. It was a classic move: punish the victim with more administrative burden rather than fix the underlying systemic failure of market incentives and vendor quality control. The government got out the wrench, but they used it to tighten the paperwork, not to fix the cracked foundation. And all this while the finger-pointing of the blame game blocker continued its weary, circular dance, ensuring that accountability remained an unsolved mystery. The moment the digital smoke cleared, the predictable, infuriating spiral began: the blame game blocker instead of a unified defense strategy. The immediate aftermath devolved into a frantic, circular exercise in corporate and governmental finger-pointing. The goal was not remediation or prevention, it was the immediate, desperate search for a plausible scapegoat to shield executive suites and political offices. From the massive public backlash, everyone had a pre-written statement absolving themselves. Insurance providers still arguing about the definition of an act of war in their policy fine print blamed the hospitals for ignoring basic security hygiene and prioritizing shiny medical equipment over firewalls. Hospitals, reeling from the financial and reputational damage of paying the $10 million decryption key, pointed fingers at the gigantic EMR vendors for shipping complex, vulnerable software riddled with known exploits, the infamous EMR meltdown systems. And those EMR vendors, they blame the hospitals for failing to install the critical patches that, admittedly, they sometimes release 6 months late, and only after major vulnerabilities were publicly disclosed. Cause: systemic failure and catastrophic financial losses necessitated finding a single point of failure for liability purposes. Effect: corporations, insurers, and government agencies engaged in continuous public denial, obscuring the true, complex, multi-party responsibility. Consequence: accountability vanished, allowing the fundamental architectural flaws like technical debt and poor vendor security to remain unaddressed. Narrator meta commentary: the modern corporation excels at two things: maximizing shareholder value and crafting an airtight legal narrative of non-culpability. They spend more money on PR spin than on actual endpoint security. Meanwhile, the government agencies, fresh off getting out the wrench, continued their own blame cascade. They pointed to the weak enforcement of previous compliance standards while ignoring the fact that those very standards were often vague, poorly funded mandates that prioritized checking boxes over actual security resilience. The IT teams, the existential dread heroes who had been warning management for years, were often the easiest, lowest-ranking target for internal blame, proving once again that in a failure of leadership, the frontline workers pay the price. The quick snapshot line here: a congressional hearing following one major breach spent 85% of its time debating whether the definition of protected health information should include encrypted data, rather than discussing the practical steps needed to prevent the next attack. Priorities: this paralysis of accountability was the ransomware as a service gig's best friend. As long as the giants were busy deflecting blame and arguing over who should pay the legal fees, they weren't collectively funding a unified defense, sharing threat intelligence, or lobbying for mandatory simple security baselines like Zero Trust, the unpopular hero. The entire ecosystem was structured to reward short-term financial optimization, i.e., slashing security budgets and deflect responsibility. When the inevitable catastrophic failure occurred, the only thing that truly flowed seamlessly was the money into the criminal crypto wallets and the legal fees into the defense attorneys' pockets. The lesson learned: the system is designed to punish the users and reward the lawyers, ensuring that the inertia of insecurity remains the most powerful force in modern healthcare. The digital siege was lifted, but the political and corporate siege of accountability was just beginning, ensuring that the next wave of attacks was already funded and practically guaranteed. The digital underworld wasn't satisfied with merely creating one successful attack. They democratized it, leading to the explosive rise of the ransomware as a service gig RAS. This model completely transformed sophisticated digital crime from a highly technical, exclusive endeavor into an accessible, profitable franchise model for anyone with a grudge, a basic understanding of phishing, and a VPN. RAS fundamentally lowered the barrier to entry, turning high-level hacking into a subscription service, mimicking the legitimate software-as-a-service SaaS economy, except, the product is digital misery. Think of it like this: the RAS operators were the elite developers, creating the flawless, highly encrypted malware, the user-friendly dashboards, the anonymous payment portals, and even 24/7's customer support for their affiliates. The customers were then responsible only for distribution. They didn't need to code or understand network architecture. They just needed to cast the net phishing, exploiting a known vulnerability, and wait for a hit. The affiliates paid a fee or, more commonly, split the ransom, often getting a significant cut of the $10 million decryption key, while the developer got a steady stream of passive income. Cause skilled developers commoditize complex ransomware code and infrastructure into an easy-to-use, subscription-based platform. Effect: the sheer volume and sophistication of attacks skyrocketed, enabling low-skill actors to target high-value infrastructure like healthcare. Consequence: law enforcement struggled with attribution, and the revenue stream for cybercrime became consistent, massive, and highly difficult to intercept. Narrator meta commentary: the ultimate late-stage capitalism irony. Even international crime rings are optimized by the SaaS model. It's a distributed, highly efficient, profit-sharing model for global extortion. The free market found a way to monetize digital evil. This democratization was catastrophic for security. In the old days, you only worried about a handful of elite, state-sponsored, or highly skilled criminal gangs. With RAS, you now worried about every bored teenager, disgruntled ex-employee, or low-level syndicate member who could afford the subscription fee. The attack surface expanded exponentially. The RAS platforms themselves were marketed aggressively on the dark web, complete with user reviews, tiered service plans, and guarantees of encryption quality. It's a digital marketplace for malicious tools, a perverse parallel economy thriving in the shadows. The quick snapshot line here: some RAS affiliate programs offer a profit split as high as 80% to the affiliate, illustrating how the operators prioritize volume of attacks over a larger individual cut, effectively turning their malware into a low-overhead, high-volume income generator. The financial incentive of the RAS model became the engine driving the continuous innovation in attack methods. If a security firm found a way to decrypt one version, the RAS developers would instantly roll out a patch, a malevolent update, if you will, to their affiliates, ensuring the malware remained one step ahead of the white hat defenders. The speed of iteration in the criminal underground often outpaced the slow, heavily regulated, and budget-conscious response of institutions like hospitals. This entire gig ensured that the blame game blocker was structurally guaranteed to continue. The affiliate was often based in one country, the developer in another, the payment funneled through servers in a third, and the victim located in a fourth. A globalized problem, localized pain at its most efficient. Attributing the attack to a specific entity or country became a legal and intelligence nightmare, allowing the RAS developers to operate with near-total impunity, simply because there were too many hands in the digital cookie jar, all motivated by that sweet, untraceable cryptocurrency. As if digital paralysis weren't enough, the criminals introduced a horrifying escalation: the data leakage blackmail. This marked the transition from single extortion, encrypt the data, to the far more malicious and reputationally catastrophic double extortion. The threat shifted from mere system lockout, which hospitals could theoretically recover from using pristine, offline backups, to the public release of intimate patient files. The moment the attackers exfiltrated gigabytes of protected health information, PHI, including diagnoses, social security numbers, addresses, and treatment notes, the crisis escalated from a financial hit to a catastrophic, potentially life-ruining privacy breach. They didn't just lock the keys to the hospital, they stole the keys to the patient's entire confidential medical history. This was a psychological masterstroke of cruelty. The criminals knew that the hospital board might be able to ethically justify not paying a ransom for decryption if they had good backups, but they absolutely could not afford the immense legal penalties, stock price plunge, and shattered public trust that would follow the mass publication of patient files on a dark web leak site. Cause: ransomware gangs adapted their tactics to ensure payment, even when victims had reliable backups, by stealing sensitive data prior to encryption. Effect: the threat shifted from operational downtime to permanent reputational damage and legal liability under privacy regulations like HIPAA. Consequence: hospitals were forced to negotiate and often pay, regardless of their recovery capabilities, essentially financing the next wave of attacks. Narrator meet a commentary. The criminals cleverly leveraged the system's compliance requirements against it. They weaponized the very laws designed to protect patient privacy, forcing the institutions to choose between funding crime and facing certain, immediate legal ruin. This blackmail tactic forced the hospital into an immediate, irreversible, no-win situation. If they didn't pay the $10 million decryption key, the attacker would publish the data. If they did pay, they were bankrolling a ransomware as a service gig organization, ensuring future attacks on others, and still had no absolute guarantee the data wouldn't leak later. It's the ultimate zero-sum game of modern security. The criminals had introduced a human element of terror. The patient's fear of having their most sensitive secrets auctioned off to the highest bidder, which instantly trumped any corporate financial calculation against paying the ransom. The quick snapshot line here: in a disturbing trend, some double extortion groups have started triple extortion, not only encrypting and leaking data, but also launching coordinated distributed denial of service (DDoS) attacks against the hospital's public website during negotiation to increase pressure. They literally fight on three fronts. The negotiation in the dark web negotiation theater suddenly became darker and more urgent. The criminals would often release a small sample packet of the stolen data, a handful of patient records, as a chilling proof of capability. Here is the first page of Mrs. Henderson's psychiatric notes. The rest is coming soon unless you pay. This rapid escalation completely sidestepped the blame game blocker arguments. No amount of finger pointing could undo the fact that the most intimate data was now sitting on a server, waiting for a published command. This confirmed the grim reality. In the modern digital age, privacy is just another commodity to be stolen and sold, and the hospitals, despite their best efforts and legal obligations, were merely the custodians of the crime scene. The devastating conclusion to this digital drama is the pay or burn logic trap. Organizations, particularly in the life-critical healthcare sector, were secretly funding the ransom payments, thus creating a vicious, self-perpetuating market for cybercrime. They were essentially bankrolling the next attack against themselves or their competitors, and they knew it. The ethical dilemma was monstrous, yet the choice was agonizingly pragmatic. The logic was cold. The cost of the $10 million decryption key was horrific, but the cost of not paying was arguably worse. Non-payment meant weeks or months of sustained sideline patience, digital triage, massive revenue loss, crippling lawsuits, and guaranteed regulatory fines under HIPAA due to the data leakage blackmail. Paying the ransom, while morally bankrupt and politically discouraged by agencies like the FBI, offered the fastest path back to operational function and the best, albeit shaky, chance of preventing the stolen patient data from being broadcast across the dark web. The choice boiled down to immediate operational survival versus long-term societal responsibility, and survival almost always won. Cause: the immediate existential threat to patient lives and massive fines for data leakage created an overwhelming incentive for payment. Effect: payment legitimized the criminal business model, provided vast, untraceable capital, and fueled the growth of the ransomware as a service gig. Consequence: the global cybercrime economy became a multi-billion-dollar market where criminals could reliably profit from targeting critical infrastructure. Narrator meet a commentary. The market worked perfectly here. The hospitals had a time-sensitive, non-optional need, and the criminals supplied the only solution. The failure wasn't technical. It was a pure, predatory market failure allowed by systemic insecurity. The payment process itself was a humiliating ballet of compliance and crime. The hospital's representative, usually an incident response firm, the digital mercenaries charging emergency rates, would purchase massive amounts of Bitcoin or Monero, the preferred, less traceable cryptocurrency, and negotiate the final price down in the dark web negotiation theater. They would then wire the crypto to the attacker's wallet, often receiving a rudimentary, often buggy, decryption tool in return. The moment that payment went through, a few $1 million flowed directly into the criminal ecosystem, funding better tools, faster encryption, and the recruitment of more affiliates. The quick snapshot line here: experts calculate that every successful $1 million ransom payment creates enough capital for RAS groups to fund approximately 20 to 30 new, equally sophisticated initial access attempts on similar organizations. Every payout is an investment in future crime. This cycle is the central, infuriating contradiction of the entire modern digital economy. Governments publicly told companies not to pay. But the governments hadn't fixed the systemic vulnerabilities, nor did they provide a viable, quick, non-ransom path to recovery for a hospital paralyzed by encrypted records. The result was that every victim was forced to become a silent enabler of the criminal market. They were caught in the trap: pay the criminals to restore operations, or risk patients dying and your organization crumbling under legal scrutiny. This moral and financial compromise ensured that, despite all the press conferences and government gets out the wrench rhetoric, the business of digital extortion remained the single most profitable, low-risk criminal enterprise of the decade. They paid the digital toll, and the bandits bought a bigger, more sophisticated gun for the next victim down the road. The astonishing success of the attack was often not due to a direct frontal assault on the main hospital servers, but the insidious backdoor entry provided by the supply chain virus. The hackers didn't even need to breach the hardened hospital network perimeter. They simply exploited a known but unpatched vulnerability in a third-party software vendor, say a specialized medical transcription service, or more commonly an antiquated billing software used by thousands of providers. This illustrated the horrifying fragility and cascading failure of vendor trust in the era of maximum digital interconnection. In modern healthcare, everything is outsourced, cloud-based, and interconnected. Patient scheduling, remote imaging analysis, billing, claims processing, and digital prescription routing. Each of these vendors, these digital subcontractors, had some form of persistent, trusted access to the core hospital network, usually to push or pull data automatically. The attackers understood that the smallest, weakest link in this chain was the easiest way in. Why spend months trying to crack the hospital's heavily funded main firewall, when you can use a $50 phishing kit from a ransomware as a service gig to compromise a regional lab's decades-old claims submission server that still runs on a vulnerable operating system? Cause hospitals granted broad, trusted network access to dozens of third-party vendors for specialized services, billing, labs, etc. Effect: a compromise at the weakest vendor became a single point of failure, allowing hackers to pivot immediately into the main hospital network. Consequence: the attack vector became almost impossible to defend against, as hospitals had to audit the security of hundreds of small, separate business entities. Narrator meta commentary: the relentless pursuit of maximum operational efficiency, the core tenet of modern business, built an inherently insecure network. They optimized their way right into a catastrophic, multi-party disaster zone. Once the supply chain vendor was compromised, the hackers used that trusted connection to move laterally into the hospital's main network, where they deployed the ransomware payload on the massive centralized EMR meltdown systems and exfiltrated the sensitive data for data leakage blackmail. The hospital was now the victim of a crime committed through a trusted partner, fundamentally shattering the concept of a clear security perimeter. They could patch their own systems daily, but if their dental benefits provider was running a vulnerable version of a 15-year-old file transfer application, the entire institution was still exposed. The quick snapshot line here: in one massive healthcare disruption, the initial access broker sold the compromised credentials for a third-party remote IT maintenance tool, which had access to dozens of separate hospital networks on a dark web forum for the equivalent of $15,000. That's the price of a critical access point to national infrastructure. The failure was not just technical, it was a profound failure of vendor risk management. Hospitals prioritized cost and convenience in selecting these third-party tools, relying on vague contractual language about industry-standard security rather than rigorous, continuous audits of their partners' actual security posture. The result was that the trust deficit went viral. The blame game blocker suddenly gained a dozen new targets, all pointing fingers at each other, creating a legal and technical Gordian knot that only slowed down the already agonizing cleanup process. The fundamental lesson was clear: in an interconnected world, your security is only as strong as the shakiest link in your entire chain of business partners. And in the relentless pursuit of profit, that chain is almost always made of cheap, brittle plastic. In the wake of the colossal digital mess, the government's instinctual solution was to administer a massive dose of bureaucratic painkillers, culminating in the post-attack compliance avalanche. Regulatory bodies didn't respond by funding proactive, cutting-edge defense technologies. Instead, they dumped an avalanche of new, hyper-detailed, and often impossible to implement compliance paperwork onto the already reeling healthcare sector. This was the ultimate bureaucratic non-solution. Instead of mandating simple, effective defenses like zero trust, the unpopular hero, or enforcing swift, timely patching, The regulatory focus defaulted to accountability after the fact. Hospitals, already hemorrhaging money and resources from paying the $10 million decryption key and dealing with the EMR meltdown, now face dozens of new reporting mandates. They weren't focused on actually fixing the core network vulnerabilities. They were focused on documenting, in triplicate, precisely how the failure occurred, and what exhaustive, often redundant, processes they were implementing to check regulatory boxes. Cause, government and agencies needed to show immediate, visible action and assert legal authority following a major public-facing failure. Effect, new, complex, and resource-intensive compliance rules were created, shifting hospital IT focus from defense to documentation. Consequence, healthcare organizations spend millions on compliance audits and paperwork, diverting funds that could have been used for real security upgrades. Ensuring the cycle of vulnerability continued, narrator media commentary, the compliance industry scored a massive payday, proving that when the system fails, the paper pushers thrive. They weaponize complexity to mask the core failure of enforcement and proactive investment. The absurdity lay in the incentives. Compliance in healthcare has historically meant adhering to the letter of the law, the checkbox approach. Did you encrypt the data? Check. Did you notify the proper authorities within 72 hours? Check. It didn't mean actual, demonstrated resilience. This avalanche ensured that hospitals prioritized satisfying an external auditor, a passive measurement of adherence over implementing dynamic, active security defenses capable of stopping a determined ransomware as a service gig affiliate. It was security by spreadsheet, a beautifully organized burial ground for the IT budget. The quick snapshot line here, compliance experts estimated that for every full-time security engineer a hospital hired, they were forced to hire 2 full-time compliance officers just to handle the new regulatory and reporting burden following the major breach wave. Staffing, priorities, meet reality. This mountain of paperwork also perfectly enabled the continuation of the blame game. Blocker, with every failure documented across dozens of regulatory forms, the lawyers had more ammunition for the inevitable lawsuits, but the IT teams had less time to actually secure the systems. The new compliance requirements rarely addressed the root cause of the crisis, which was often the unsexy, systemic underinvestment in foundational IT infrastructure, the old tech debt grievance that had festered for decades. The focus remained reactive, punitive, and administrative, ensuring that the hospital felt the pain of the crisis long after the systems were technically back online, confirming that the bureaucratic solution to a complex technical problem is always without fail more paperwork. The entire debacle had a root cause that was less cyber thriller and more corporate finance tragedy. The old tech debt grievance. The whole catastrophic failure was revealed to be rooted in decades of hospitals prioritizing visible, politically expedient, and revenue-generating capital investments like the latest MRI machine, with a fancy ribbon-cutting ceremony over the desperately needed but unsexy foundational IT upgrades. Cybersecurity was seen as an operational expense OPEX, a line item to be trimmed, while the shiny new scanner was a capital expenditure CAPEX, a tangible asset that attracted patience and bond ratings. This budgetary imbalance created a system that was technologically top-heavy and structurally fragile. They had cutting-edge surgical robots running on networks protected by firewalls that hadn't been updated since the first Matrix movie came out. The legacy systems, outdated operating systems, unpatched medical devices, and custom-built software from the 1990s piled up like unpaid bills, forming a massive technical debt that was quietly waiting to bankrupt the entire operation. This debt was invisible to the board until the moment the EMR meltdown caused patient chaos. Cause, financial incentives favored large capital investments, new hardware over continuous, unglamorous operational spending, IT maintenance and security. Effect, essential IT systems were left running on legacy, vulnerable software, creating a massive, single point of failure. Consequence, the short-term savings on IT maintenance exploded into multi-million-dollar ransoms and exponentially higher recovery costs. Narrator media commentary, the CFOs chased the short-term ribbon-cutting photo op, neglecting the digital foundation, proving that maximizing perceived efficiency today is the best way to guarantee existential failure tomorrow. It's penny-wise and patient-foolish. The complexity was maddening. Many life-saving medical devices, the infusion pumps, the patient monitors, the lab analyzers came straight from the manufacturer running versions of Windows that the general public stopped using 10 years ago, replacing the $2 million MRI machine just because its control console runs Windows 7. and can't be patched is not a feasible option for a community hospital. The IT team could isolate these devices, but the mandate for interconnectedness, the glorious, seamless flow of data promised by EMR systems, forced them to plug these insecure devices right back into the main network, essentially wiring a ticking bomb directly into the central nervous system. The quick snapshot line here: internal hospital reports often showed that IT security spending, as a percentage of overall annual operating budget, was consistently 1/3 to 1/2 the recommended baseline for organizations handling high-value, critical infrastructure. The result of this tech debt was a system running on faith, not security. When the supply chain virus finally found its way in, the malware wasn't stopped by an alert or a modern defense. It often spread effortlessly because it hit systems that had long since passed their digital expiration date. The post-attack compliance avalanche that followed this mess did nothing to help this root problem. The regulatory bodies demanded more paperwork proving compliance with rules that were often incompatible with the ancient hardware still essential to patient care. The hospitals were caught between the Scylla of unpatchable decade-old technology and the Charybdis of a new cyber threat landscape, all because the board years ago thought a new coat of paint was more important than a new secure foundation. The entire phenomenon of the healthcare hack crisis can be summarized as a globalized problem. Localized pain. The criminal crews responsible for launching these devastating, highly organized attacks were almost universally geographically dispersed, often operating from the safe harbors of nations hostile or indifferent to international law enforcement. This dispersion meant that global law enforcement was always a critical step behind. While the damage remained acutely localized to specific neighborhoods, vulnerable hospital systems, and, most cruelly, vulnerable patient populations, the ransomware itself was digital, easily purchased via the ransomware as a service gig platform, and instantly deployable from 1,000 miles away. The actual pain, however, was agonizingly physical. A rural hospital forced to turn away trauma patients, a mother in the emergency room delayed because her EMR meltdown history was locked, or a patient losing crucial treatment time because their medication dosage couldn't be verified. The attackers never had to look their victims in the eye. They just saw a lucrative IP address attached to a non-negotiable crypto demand. Cause the ROS model, combined with cryptocurrency and hostile foreign jurisdictions, allowed criminal groups to operate without fear of immediate international arrest. Effect: law enforcement faced massive jurisdictional hurdles and slow diplomatic processes, making proactive arrests nearly impossible. Consequence: criminal profitability soared, and the local victims, the hospitals and patients, bore the entire brunt of the globalized cyber warfare. Narrator meta commentary: the legal and political frameworks are still running on dial-up speed, while the criminals are operating on gigabit fiber, resulting in a systemic failure to protect critical infrastructure from non-state actors operating with state-level impunity. The pursuit of justice became a slow, frustrating game of international paperwork. A federal agency might identify the servers hosting the dark web negotiation theater, or trace the crypto wallets used to receive the $10 million decryption key. But getting a hostile foreign government to cooperate to raid the location, seize the assets, or extradite the culprits was often a geopolitical nightmare that could take years, if it happened at all. Meanwhile, the very same crew, or a new affiliate that licensed their tools, was already launching the next attack, funded by the profits of the last. The quick snapshot line here. Interpol estimated that the average time elapsed between identifying a major ransomware group's core infrastructure and obtaining the necessary international warrants for a coordinated takedown was 18 to 24 months, giving the criminals massive operational lead time. The most profound impact was the uneven distribution of harm. The most financially constrained hospitals, those already struggling due to the pressures of the old tech debt grievance and razor-thin margins, were often the easiest and most desperate targets. They lacked the robust zero trust, the unpopular hero defenses, and the in-house legal muscle of larger, well-heeled urban academic centers. So, the rural and underserved communities, the populations already struggling with healthcare access, were hit hardest, suffering the greatest number of sidelined patients. Digital triage events. The global pursuit of illicit profit resulted in highly specific, localized suffering, underscoring the deep ethical chasm between the anonymity of the internet and the fragile reality of physical human life. The chilling digital siege didn't just cause operational downtime, it created a massive, existential crisis of confidence. The trust deficit goes viral. The public health fallout wasn't merely the inconvenience of sidelined patients' digital triage. It was a profound, newly minted fear that their most confidential, highly sensitive medical history, everything from mental health notes to HIV status, was now sitting on a dark web leak site in a digital pirate's lair, accessible to anyone who cared to look. For decades, the security and privacy of a hospital system was implicitly trusted. Now, that trust had evaporated overnight, replaced by a visceral anxiety amplified by every news report of a data leakage blackmail threat. The whole promise of digital health, the seamless, efficient EMR meltdown, collapsed into a pile of encrypted anxiety. Patients began to fear that their data would be used for insurance fraud, identity theft, or, worst of all, personal blackmail. This erosion of confidence had a direct, dangerous impact on care. Patients became hesitant to share full, sensitive information with their providers, fearing it would just become the next commodity to be stolen by a ransomware as a service gig affiliate. Cause, double extortion tactics, and the public nature of data leak sites exposed the fragile security of highly sensitive patient data. Effect: patients lost confidence in the system's ability to protect their privacy, leading to hesitation in sharing crucial medical details. Consequence: physicians began working with incomplete data, increasing the risk of medical errors and fundamentally degrading the quality of care, thus spreading the damage far beyond the immediate network outage. Narrator Meta commentary: the human price of digital negligence is paid in silence and fear. The system that was supposed to save us inadvertently forced patients into a terrifying choice: risk privacy or risk receiving incomplete medical treatment. The sheer volume of exposed records made the crisis feel inescapable. Millions of confidential files, the raw, intimate details of human illness and struggle, were suddenly part of the global black market inventory. This crisis was the final, brutal realization that security compliance had failed to deliver actual security. The hospital had checked all the regulatory boxes, suffered the post-attack compliance avalanche, and still failed to protect the core asset, the patient's privacy and dignity. The quick snapshot line here: surveys following a major health system hack showed that patient willingness to adopt new digital health technologies, such as remote monitoring apps and telehealth, dropped by nearly 50%, forcing the retreat from digital innovation. This deficit in trust created a catastrophic ripple effect, becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy of insecurity. The system lost revenue not just from operational downtime, but from patients actively switching providers to unhacked facilities, or delaying care entirely due to fear of data exposure. The institution spent millions trying to rebuild public trust with PR campaigns and free credit monitoring, but that doesn't repair the core break. When the most important promise a healthcare provider makes to keep your secrets safe, while they save your life, is shattered by a foreign hacker armed with an old tech debt grievance exploit, you don't just lose files, you lose the essential contract between doctor and patient. The crisis was no longer just about Bitcoin. It was about the utter collapse of faith in the digital custodian. The sleek, insidious efficiency of the entire operation was ultimately enabled by the cryptocurrency gateway drug, the necessity of untraceable Bitcoin, or, increasingly, Monero for ransom payments, made the entire extortion life cycle smooth, swift, and completely detached from the traditional financial system's safeguards. Without cryptocurrency, wiring a multi-million-dollar ransom would involve banks, wire transfers, regulatory oversight, and a mountain of international paperwork that would instantly trigger flags and freeze funds. With crypto, it was a peer-to-peer transaction completed in minutes, often with near-total anonymity for the recipient. Cryptocurrency transformed ransomware from a cumbersome, localized crime into a scalable, a globalized problem mega business. The criminal syndicates the ransomware as a service gig operators preferred it precisely because it minimized the risk of detection and maximized the speed of payment, an essential feature given the time-sensitive nature of the pay-or-burn logic trap faced by hospitals. It was the perfect currency for digital extortion: fast, irreversible, and difficult for law enforcement to seize or trace across multiple, uncooperative international jurisdictions. Cause: cryptocurrency enabled rapid, cross-border, irreversible, and pseudonymous payment without the need for traditional banking intermediaries. Effect: ransomware payments could be efficiently processed and laundered, removing the biggest bottleneck for large-scale digital extortion. Consequence: the financial engine of cybercrime received a massive, untraceable capital injection, fueling the expansion and sophistication of future attacks. Narrator Meta commentary: technology designed to democratize finance was immediately weaponized to industrialize crime. The decentralization that enthusiasts hailed as liberation was the same feature that granted international criminals total operational freedom. The anonymity was only part of the problem. While Bitcoin transactions are publicly visible on the ledger, tying those wallets to real-world identities is incredibly difficult, especially when the criminals use mixers or tumblers' digital laundering services to obscure the origin of the funds they were running their profits through a decentralized digital wash cycle. Meanwhile, privacy-focused coins like Monero were designed from the ground up to completely hide the sender, receiver, and amount of the transaction, turning the trace operation into a pure intelligence guessing game. The quick snapshot line here: after major hacks, specialized incident response firms that negotiated the ransom often had a separate team of crypto analysts whose sole job was to track the ransom payment across the blockchain, but who could typically trace less than 15% of the funds to an identifiable cash-out point. The inability to effectively block or seize these crypto assets undermined the entire government strategy of discouraging ransom payments. The FBI and other agencies could loudly proclaim their don't pay policy, but if the hospital couldn't restore systems from their now encrypted backups and faced the imminent threat of data leakage blackmail, that policy meant nothing. The quick, decisive payment offered by the digital black market was simply too compelling an option for the desperate board caught in the throes of the EMR meltdown. Cryptocurrency was the lifeblood of this new, optimized criminal ecosystem, ensuring that every time a hospital paid the ransom, they weren't just buying back their own data. They were investing in the continued reign of digital terror. The painful irony of the entire crisis was the existence of a perfectly good solution that nobody wanted to buy: Zero Trust, the unpopular hero. The painfully obvious industry-accepted security solution, the Never Trust, Always Verify model that eliminates implicit trust within the network perimeter, was deemed complicated, too expensive, and potentially too disruptive to implement, until the catastrophic financial cost of not implementing it hit billions of dollars. The old thinking was simple: secure the outer wall, the perimeter firewall, and assume everyone and everything inside that wall, the doctor's laptop, the ancient MRI machine, the third-party billing service, is inherently trustworthy. The Zero Trust architecture ZTA throws that absurd premise into the trash. It dictates that every single device, user, and application, whether connecting from across the globe or the desk next door, must be continuously authenticated, authorized, and monitored. This model uses micro-segmentation, breaking the network into tiny, isolated zones so that if a hacker compromises one machine via a supply chain virus exploit, they can't simply move laterally to the EMR meltdown server or the expensive medical devices. It limits the blast radius of a breach to a single, contained area. Cause: ZTA implementation requires a massive overhaul of network architecture, strong political will, and continuous operational spending. Effect: hospitals avoided ZTA to save short-term costs and maintain the convenience of the old, flat network model. Consequence: the cost of a single ransomware event, including ransom, downtime, and legal fees, quickly dwarfed the projected cost of implementing ZTA across the entire organization. Narrator meta commentary: healthcare waited until the theoretical risk became a multi-million-dollar existential certainty before deciding that maybe, just maybe, continuous verification was cheaper. Then becoming an unwilling financier of the cryptocurrency gateway drug cartel, the barrier to adoption wasn't technical impossibility, it was inertia and cost, driven by the old tech debt grievance. Hospital boards, concerned with quarterly budgets and avoiding any friction that might slow down clinical workflows, were resistant to implementing a system that required doctors to re-authenticate access to sensitive data based on context, e.g., is this laptop patched? Is this user trying to access pediatric charts from a coffee shop in Bali? It was viewed as the security over sanity solution. The estimated capital expenditure for a full ZTA rollout seemed enormous, a clear line item that finance could slash, especially when the probability of a catastrophic hack was just a vague IT fear, not yet a public shaming covered by the news. The quick snapshot line here: post-breach analysis consistently showed that if the affected hospitals had implemented just the key ZTA components, universal multi-factor authentication MFA, and micro-segmentation, over 90% of the ransomware attacks would have been contained or blocked entirely. The ultimate brutal realization was that the high price of ZTA was actually the insurance premium for operational continuity, not an optional feature. The billions lost to ransom payments and recovery efforts after the hacks finally provided the undeniable financial justification. Spending $50 million on advanced security infrastructure is dramatically cheaper than losing to $100 million to a forced shutdown and years of legal and reputational damage from a data leakage blackmail crisis. The unpopular hero finally got its chance, but only after the villains had successfully burned down HIPAA, the digital village, proving once again that in the modern economy incentives only align with reality once the total loss reaches 7 figures or more. The dry, corporate language of system downtime and data integrity finally translated into the gut-wrenching reality of the human cost tally. The crisis forced a terrifying confrontation with the true, ultimate casualty of the digital war: delayed critical care, compromised procedures, and in documented cases, patient fatalities. This was the moment the cyber crisis stopped being an IT problem and became a crime against public health. The economic analysis of the attacks often focused on the staggering cost of downtime: millions lost per hour, billions in aggregate, but those statistics masked the reality of the patient lying in the bed, a delay in chemotherapy verification, a sidelined patient whose cardiac scan couldn't be read digitally, an ambulance diverted to a hospital an hour farther away. These administrative roadblocks were literally adding risk to already precarious human situations. It turned out that when an automated system failed, the consequence was not a refund. It was a potentially fatal medical error, a direct consequence of technology failing the old tech debt grievance. Test, cause, the time-critical nature of medical treatment, coupled with the reliance on interconnected digital systems, meant downtime equaled a loss of treatment time. Effect, studies correlated ransomware attacks with significant increases in adverse patient events and mortality rates at affected and neighboring hospitals due to overload. Consequence, the ethical stakes were irrevocably raised, proving that cyber attacks on critical infrastructure were no longer just white-collar crime, but a threat to life crime. Narrator meta commentary: the systems were designed to minimize clinical risk, but the financial underinvestment in security maximized systemic risk. The balance sheet looked good, until the cost was measured in delayed life-saving treatment. They gambled with human lives and lost. The evidence emerged in grim postmortems: the patient who died because their urgent care was delayed by an hour due to ambulance diversion, or the internal reports detailing increased complications because doctors lacked instant, accurate access to the full EMR meltdown history and had to rely on handwritten notes and memory. The attackers who saw their ransomware as a legitimate revenue stream in the cryptocurrency gateway drug market had blood on their digital hands, even if they were thousands of miles away, enjoying the untraceable proceeds of the pay or burn logic trap. The quick snapshot line here: one legal filing alleged that a hospital's inability to access electronic fetal monitoring data during a ransomware outage directly obscured critical information about a compromised birth, highlighting the tragic intersection of digital failure and immediate physical harm. This grim tally served as the ultimate, unforgiving audit of the healthcare sector's complacency. It proved that the lack of zero trust, the unpopular hero security, was not just a violation of some abstract compliance regulation, it was a moral failure. The tragedy forced the realization that investing in robust, multi-layered cybersecurity was not an option for maximizing profit. It was a fundamental requirement for minimizing patient harm. The cost of technical neglect had transitioned from a financial estimate to a horrifying reality, forcing the hand of the very people who had resisted funding the necessary defenses: the executive suites. The realization of the true, devastating cost of digital complacency finally delivered the boardroom's sudden awakening. The executive suites, those lofty decision-makers who had previously viewed cybersecurity as a necessary but ultimately optional cost center to be minimized, were violently re-educated by the sight of their public reputation cratering faster than their stock price. This was not a theoretical risk discussed in a footnote. It was existential financial and ethical ruin broadcast on cable news, complete with the tragic narrative of the human cost tally. The primary pain point wasn't the $10 million decryption key payment itself. It was the financial ripple effect. Suddenly, investor confidence evaporated. Hospital stock for publicly traded health systems plummeted. Revenue streams dried up instantly because the billing systems, hit by the supply chain virus via a third party, couldn't process claims. The cost of recovery, legal fees, forced public notification of the data leakage blackmail, and the guaranteed penalties from the post-attack compliance avalanche dwarfed the money saved by years of trimming the IT budget. Cause, financial and reputational damage became massive and immediate, triggering fiduciary and legal alarm bells far louder than IT warnings ever could. Effect, cybersecurity instantly transitioned from an IT department cost center to a non-negotiable enterprise risk managed at the CEO and board level. Consequence: massive. Emergency funding was finally allocated to security, but only after the organizations had paid the catastrophic price of waiting. Narrator meta commentary: the corporate world only truly believes in something when the cost of ignoring it hits the quarterly earnings report. The patient death was a tragedy. The stock price plunge was a shareholder emergency. They prioritized the latter. The awakening was marked by frantic, reactive spending. The budgets that were impossible to secure just 6 months prior, for things like specialized threat intelligence services, continuous monitoring, and the despised zero trust. The unpopular hero rollout were approved in emergency, off-the-books meetings. The Chief Information Security Officer (CISO), who had previously been relegated to presenting dry slides about compliance during the last 10 minutes of the board meeting, was suddenly treated like a wartime general granted unlimited resources to defeat the globalized problem now sitting inside the network. The quick snapshot line here: after the major health system breaches, job postings for CISO roles that specifically reported directly to the CEO instead of the CIO or CFO doubled in volume, signaling the sudden high-stakes political elevation of digital security expertise. This sudden realization that technical debt was a financial time bomb confirmed a harsh truth: the decades of prioritizing new medical technology. The old tech debt grievance over security resilience had been an enormous systemic market failure. The boards were re-educated in the most violent way possible, forced to confront the fact that in the interconnected digital age, managing reputation and financial risk requires robust technology, not just aspirational security policies nobody enforces. They had learned the hard way that when the internet gets messy, the boardroom gets blamed. Despite the panic, the billions spent, and the boardroom's sudden awakening, the grim reaper of digital insecurity was already setting up the inevitable sequel setup. The fundamental, systemic vulnerabilities in healthcare's reliance on fragile, legacy systems remain profoundly unaddressed. The immediate crisis response addressed the symptoms: paying the ransom, recovering the files, hiring external consultants, but not the disease: an outdated, complex, and desperately under-resourced digital infrastructure. The core problem was still the entanglement of life-critical, often old-tech debt grievance systems, like imaging machines running unsupported software with the rest of the network, made worse by the reliance on an opaque, vulnerable supply chain virus of third-party vendors. The rush to get back online meant that many organizations merely patched the exploited hole and restored the EMR meltdown systems, rather than undertaking the multi-year complex overhaul required to implement resilient architectural change like zero trust. The unpopular hero: they fixed the burst pipe but failed to replace the rusting, century-old plumbing. Cause: the immense pressure to restore clinical operations immediately led hospitals to prioritize short-term fixes and restoration over fundamental security reconstruction. Effect: systemic vulnerabilities, especially reliance on legacy systems and interconnected, flat networks, persisted, leaving open the same attack vectors. Consequence: the entire healthcare ecosystem remained a lucrative and easily exploitable target, effectively guaranteeing the success of the next wave of sophisticated, ROS-driven attacks. Narrator meta commentary: the cycle of crisis is the perfect business model for everyone except the patients. The hackers get funded, the consultants get paid fortunes for remediation, and the hospitals ensure job security for the next generation of digital mercenaries. The irony here is stomach-churning. The institutions spend millions on legal counsel and the post-attack compliance avalanche paperwork, effectively documenting their vulnerability. Rather than investing that money into isolating those critical systems, they were in the pay or burn logic trap of needing speed over security. The speed of digital recovery, which looks good to the board, ensures the same fragility that allows the next globalized problem to inflict maximum localized pain. The quick snapshot line here: after recovery, one major health system revealed in its financial disclosure that it spent 3 times more on mandatory legal and PR consulting in the 6 months following the breach than it had spent on proactive security upgrades over the previous 3 years combined. This is the ultimate sequel setup. The criminal cryptocurrency gateway drug syndicates watched all this unfold, taking meticulous notes. They observed which hospitals paid, which systems were restored poorly, and which regulatory bodies merely issued fines instead of mandates for real change. They learned that the most profitable move was always the next attack. The political and business environment had created a perfect feedback loop. Lax security enables huge payouts fund better tools, and fragile systems guarantee more targets. They weren't just prepared for the next attack, they had invested heavily in it. all thanks to the initial, devastating success of the last one. The irony deepens because the healthcare industry, in its desperate scramble, had access to the tech fix that nobody used, the tools, the standards, and the architectural models needed to prevent the initial, catastrophic hack were all readily available on the market for years. Yet, the industry had deliberately made a collective organizational choice. The financial incentives favored speed and interconnectedness over hardened, isolated security. They chose the wide open, frictionless network which maximized efficiency for doctors and minimized frustration for users over the segmented, continuously verified network required for actual resilience. The key incentive was the pursuit of seamless data flow. The entire ethos of the EMR meltdown systems was instant, 360-degree access to patient data from any device, anywhere, isolating the critical network components. The micro-segmentation at the heart of Zero Trust, the unpopular hero, was seen as counterintuitive to this goal. It would introduce latency, create log and friction, and require extensive re-engineering of the ancient old tech debt grievance systems they were still using. The IT teams feared the backlash from clinicians more than they feared the inevitable hacker. Cause, seamless clinical workflow was prioritized over security segmentation due to short-term political and efficiency incentives. Effect, robust, isolated security solutions were shelved or partially implemented, leaving the networks flat and allowing malware to spread laterally with ease. Consequence, the entire interconnected infrastructure became a single, lucrative target where a small breach via a single phishing email instantly escalated to a catastrophic system-wide failure. Narrator meta commentary, they designed the network for the best-case scenario, perfect uptime, seamless sharing, and got punished by the worst-case scenario. The convenience of one-click access led directly to the terror of zero access. The market had provided the defensive solutions, hardware that allowed for strict network separation, software for multi-factor authentication across the board, and robust, air-gapped backup systems designed to survive a total ransomware event. But adopting these solutions required money OPEX. The budget category, always under the knife and political will to disrupt workflow. The boardroom's sudden awakening only happened once the cost of remediation dwarfed the cost of adoption by an order of magnitude. The rapid cause gives effect gives consequence of this negligence is brutal. Cause, hospital ops for cheap. Easy flat network architecture, maximum interconnectedness. Effect, a single compromised credential via phishing email grants the hacker access to everything. Consequence, the ransomware is deployed laterally across the entire system in minutes, leading to the massive human cost tally of downtime. The quick snapshot line here, experts revealed that the industry purchased thousands of the top-tier anti-ransomware backup solutions, but failed to physically isolate them from the main network, the air gap, allowing the initial ransomware to silently encrypt the backups alongside the live data. The safety net was attached to the same vulnerable wall. In the end, the healthcare hack crisis wasn't a failure of innovation. It was a spectacular failure of adoption and governance. The industry knew the fire extinguisher existed, had bought the fire extinguisher, but left it unlocked and connected to the same vulnerable power grid that the fire starter eventually disabled. And now, having paid the digital toll and cryptocurrency gateway drug and reputation, they were reluctantly forced to implement the very fixes they had delayed for years, providing the perfect closing act to the endless cleanup and irony. The final act of this digital tragedy is the endless cleanup and irony. The long, tedious, resource-draining cleanup effort involved spending 10 times the $10 million decryption key ransom amount on remediation, investigations, and legal fees. This culminated in the supreme irony of paying specialized private security firms exorbitant fees to rebuild the exact same insecure infrastructure that had just catastrophically failed. They paid the criminals to unlock the door and then paid the consultants a fortune to install a shiny, new, expensive door, but often on the same house with the crumbling foundation and the wide open windows. The cost cascaded uncontrollably. The ransom was the smallest expense in the entire ordeal. The real money drain came from the endless litigation related to the data leakage blackmail, the monumental task of processing the backlog created by the sideline patients, digital triage events, the huge hourly bills of the digital mercenary response teams, and the long-term penalties. From the post-attack compliance avalanche, every dollar saved during the era of the old tech debt grievance became $10 lost in the frenetic, expensive aftermath. Cause, recovery efforts required rapid, expensive technical and legal consulting, massive network cleanup, and patient notification mandates. Effect, the total cost of the attack, excluding the ransom, quickly amounted to hundreds of millions. far exceeding any original security investment proposal. Consequence: the hospitals were left financially crippled and politically exhausted, having reinforced the criminal ecosystem, while often failing to implement the fundamental security changes required to prevent the inevitable sequel setup. Narrator meta commentary: the true winners were the incident response industry and the legal compliance auditors. They are the market scavengers, thriving on the predictable cycle of corporate negligence and panic. Digital tragedy is their bottom line. The painful snapshot line here: after paying a multi-million-dollar ransom, one national health system estimated the total cost of breach notification. A simple letter to each affected patient alone exceeded the original ransom demand, proving the human cost tally had a terrifyingly high paper cost. And this brings us to the ultimate, infuriating cycle. Because they needed to keep the doors open and restore the flow of payments, many hospitals felt they could only afford a quick restore job. They re-imaged the servers, restored the data, and put the new, shiny security tools in place, but they failed to commit to the organizational, cultural, and architectural shift required for zero trust. The unpopular hero: they still had interconnected EMR meltdown systems sharing data with vulnerable partners. Via the same brittle connections, they got their decryption key, paid their fines, issued their apologies, and inadvertently sent a clear message to the ransomware as a service gig operators: we are profitable, we are vulnerable, and we will pay again. The digital dust settled, the crisis faded from the front page, but the structural flaws remained. The system had a temporary high-cost bandage slapped on a fatal wound, ensuring that the next time a criminal group decided to monetize a globalized problem, the healthcare system would be waiting, ripe and ready to suffer the excruciating localized pain all over again. It was a vicious, self-sustaining ecosystem of crime and corporate failure, all made possible by the intersection of high-value data and institutional inertia. And that's how that whole mess went down. We watched as one of the world's most critical infrastructures went from chasing efficiency headlines to frantically wiring 6 figures of Monero, to anonymous digital kidnappers in a dark web chat room. Lives paused, and for what? To finally learn that cybersecurity isn't a spreadsheet line item, it's the operational foundation of any modern system, especially one whose product is human life. The grand irony is that everyone involved, the hackers, the lawyers, the consultants, and the cyber insurance brokers, made a killing, except for the patients and the perpetually underfunded IT heroes on the front line. So, please, don't take any of this as financial, legal, or ethical advice, even though it was way more fun than reading a 50-page EULA. If you enjoyed this highly dramatic but fun version of Modern Facts, let us know in the comments what other absurd contradiction of modern life needs simplifying next. Until next time, don't trust the algorithm.